The final speaker here with us today is Professor Itamar Rabinovich. Professor Rabinovich is in Tel Aviv University, NYU, and Brookings Institution, and he was also the former Israeli ambassador to the US and the former president of the Tel Aviv University, and is currently the deputy of the managing committee of the INSS. Professor Rabinovich, please come forward. Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm here facing the familiar dilemma to whoever is at conferences and conventions where you're the final speaker in a panel. And I will quote my teacher Bernard Lewis, who said in one of these situations that the fact that most of what I wanted to say has already been said by my predecessors will not stop me from saying it anyway. And now, more seriously, first of all, I think it is very important, and I'll also try to respond to what has been said by Mr. Negroponte and Ms. Fioronte yesterday. We do not have a Berlin Wall in the Middle East, and what happened in the Eastern Europe in 1989, will not happen again in the Middle East. In Eastern Europe, in the Great Revolution of 89 to 91, and after that, two things happened. The USSR collapsed and was defeated in the Cold War, and freedom was given that allowed countries that had a tradition of civil society and democratic regime from previous years, such as the Czech Republic, Poland, at first Hungary, East Germany that was taken up by West Germany, to move sharply to a new reality. And in the Middle East, that is not the current situation. There were countries such as Egypt, Syria, Iraq. There were sort of parliamentary traditional regimes in the 30s and 40s, but that tradition was not too great, and the civil society is very weak, and therefore the insight that Mark and his team has done, this distinction they made between real, true democratization and the transit to the current situation is so relevant and so important. But you cannot expect a transition to democratization in the democracy in the sense that it exists in states such as Poland and Hungary, or the way it is in Belarus. We have to adapt it to the situation in the Middle East. Of course, the example of the USSR is more like Iran, and the campaign against Iran and the importance of focusing on the nuclear issue should also take into consideration Iran's aspiration to reach a regional hegemony, and not only take into consideration their will to obtain nuclear weapons, but also their will to become reach hegemony. And that is why what is happening in Syria right now should also be looked at through this prism. Another thing that is derived from the overall look or outlook is the very interesting words said by Ms. Pernoy yesterday, and that is the discussion between Netanyahu and Barak a year ago in the speeches and counter-speeches during Netanyahu's visit in Washington that year, and they disagreed between them, whether outwardly or inwardly, about the meaning of the Arab Spring. And President Obama emphasized the fact that Israel needs to be on the right side of history, and that more weight should be attributed to the popular opinion, and therefore Israel should make its conclusions from that. And Netanyahu was a bit more cautious, and because he's living in the area probably, And I was listening very intently to what Ambassador Negroponte has said about the American attempt, or somewhat dismal attempt, or perhaps the amusement of trying to change regimes. And part of the lessons learned are also obvious in light of the Arab Spring, and first of all that is dealing with the Egyptian crisis. We have some sort of enthusiasm, almost romantic enthusiasm, and then it sometimes fades. And now Washington is much more sober, and there is a smaller gap between what the Israelis believe and what the Americans believe, and the gap is smaller than it was a year ago. But all of this does not exempt the Israeli government from its responsibility, and I would like to reiterate or emphasize two of the points that appear in the excellent report that has been submitted, and we have read it. It's also in the brochure that Mark Heller showed us beforehand. One of the points is the Turkish point. I don't think we can overrate or exaggerate the importance of settling this dispute between us and the Turks. If there is anything, if there's one thing that Israel can do in order to participate in shaping the events in the Middle East in the coming years, is settling this dispute with the Turkish. And I'm talking about resolving this dispute with them, because I don't think that with the current regime in Turkey we can truly reach a peaceful situation the way we used to know in the 1990s, because it's an Islamist regime with its own orientation, and we will not be able to reach to renew the relationship the way we used to know it, but we can put it on the back burners, put the conflict on the back burners, and minimize the conflict as it is today. And I cannot overrate and cannot exaggerate the severity of the failure to formulate some sort of apology, as in the Chekhanova and his Turkish counterpart, and has not happened by the Israeli government. It's now water under the bridge, and instead of crying over what did not happen a few months ago, we should concentrate on what we should do today. And the counterpart, or our partner, is not a simple person, and it is not my position to speak of the Turkish government, but it is not a simple regime, and the person heading it is not uncomplex, but he has his pride, and shall we say, a very focused point of view. He focuses on his own position and his own role, and it's not simple. But it's not only the strain or the stress with Iran. Turkey, I think, is ripe for more intimate relationships with Israel. We share many more interests than it maybe seems, and the foreign minister of Turkey formulated a doctrine that Turkey has entered with into the partnership in the Middle East, and that is a zero conflict doctrine. And somebody cynically said several months ago that now before the zero we can also add another digit, 1, 2. Turkey has found out the complexity of the Middle Eastern arena, and both in Syria and in Iraq, and the severity of the Iranian challenge with the experience it had in Libya, and it understands that it is now much more complex than it perhaps thought at first. And Turkey is a country that has many powers, very significant powers. It is not a country that is unstable, but they do have the Kurdish problem, and that can be increased in a place where they were acquiring Kurdish autonomy or Kurdish sovereignty even, and they do have this minority, but it's quite large inside Turkey. They do not have Alawis, but they do have a Shiite minority that are not Alawis, but they also have a place to look. They are also looking for their place in society, and Syria and Turkey can find places to interact on. but Israel and Turkey can find areas of interaction. So the Israeli government may have to bite back some of its feelings and cooperate. And when we had the incident on the Egyptian border, in light of the sensitivity between us and Egypt, we found the strength to apologize to the Egyptians. And yesterday and today we saw the Israeli Prime Minister with phenomenal political capabilities and with rare inner strength, and we saw his defense minister as well with an impressive analysis. And I think that a government headed by these two people will find the power and the ability to do what Israel needs to do in order to resolve this current dispute with Turkey. Another point is that the recommendation of the team and is also joining other voices that it is vital that we have a peace process initiated. I am less optimistic than Ehud Yaari about the possibility of reaching an interim arrangement that he spoke of, to the extent that he spoke of, but we must initiate a move. It may not solve all the problems, but if we do not trigger this move, then we will not be able to move forward with Turkey. We will not be able to cooperate discreetly with other regimes in the area that we have, that we share interests with, not to speak or not to mention the need that Israel has to move forward and to progress on the Palestinian issue and not to let this stagnation continue, because we want to move forward. This government now has the abilities that is also unprecedented, and we can really go back to the days of Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, and maybe we hope it will find the force within to do what it needs to do. Syria. There were two interpretations, two commentaries that were a bit biased at the beginning of the Syrian crisis. Some people believed, and that was the common opinion, that Israel wants Bashar al-Assad to continue in the regime. It's a mistake that goes back to 2005 when then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon told President Bush, "This is the devil we know," and we believed we prefer him to the other alternatives when Bush wanted to overthrow Assad. But since 2006, many things have happened, and that is not currently the belief. We can see with Patrick Seal and other people a view that says that Israel, together with the United States, is doing everything it can to overthrow Bashar al-Assad's regime, and that is also not true. Israel is doing very little. It is a country whose activity in favor of the opposition will actually end up being in favor of Bashar al-Assad because of the connection with Israel and the United States. It will look like a plan to overthrow him, and to some Arabs this idea of resistance or mukawama is still very much popular in Arab opinion. So I think we should look maybe at how the Israeli Arabs are expressing themselves and the support that they are giving President Bashar al-Assad, despite what has happened over the last 18 months, because in a residual sense he is still the familiar governor, and that is his regime is a regime that is doomed. He has lost his legitimacy as the ruler of Syria. He does not control large parts of Syria, and the reason he is not being overthrown is simply because the opposition is weak, and we must distinguish between the political opposition, mostly inwardly but also from outside, that has yet to succeed to come off as the alternative. How many of you know opposition leaders, the names of 3 opposition leaders in Syria? Nobody knows. No one knows here, no one knows in other places. They have not created a situation where such as happened with Jalili, who were an alternative and can be seen as some sort of alternative government. They are weak, and that is by contrast with the de facto opposition on the ground, whether it's the revolutionary committees or the liberated army. or the jihadists that have infiltrated into Syria are making the Syrian president's life very difficult and the regime's life very difficult, because they are no longer controlling large parts of the country, and he has no remnant of legitimacy left in the country, and ultimately he will fall. Of course, how is he being strengthened? By the support of the Russians and the Iranians, and support that is much more explicit than it used to be. For months now, the Obama administration and governments in Europe have spoken against the regime and the loss of its legitimacy and the need for Bashar al-Assad to leave, but they have done nothing to promote this. And Russia and China are stopping all action in the Security Council, but this is just a lame excuse. What the European governments have done now, which is taking out its ambassadors from Syria, could have been done months ago, and they could have imposed sanctions, such as prohibiting flights from Europe to Syria and vice versa. And what will that do? That will detach or disconnect the middle classes in Syria from the regime. As long as Damascus does not join into the protest, then the regime is still solid. But as soon as they partake in the protest, the regime will fall. However, here's the concern. What will happen in Syria? If we don't know the opposition and we don't know what they will do and what they represent, the concern is that some radical Islamist regime will come up. Maybe the Alawis will go back to their mountains and they will build fortresses, and then Syria will be split up into areas. And I'm talking about a whole region that is failing, not only just the country. We will go from Syria to Lebanon. We will have three countries that are failing and do not have control of their own areas, and that will be a much bigger challenge than just that the collapse of the regime will also have implications. And of course, Syria is not Libya. It has borders with many countries, and if it causes anarchy and splits inside Syria, it will have many ramifications, and we will have to deal with them, because that could very well happen. And since more and more jihadists are now infiltrating Syria and are taking up more and more positions, perhaps we should do this sooner rather than later, and to try and bring in rationalization into the process. And Israel can really integrate into this process well, because we shouldn't be too active, but we are a neighboring country, and maybe I should remind ourselves of the role we played when Assad assumed power in the Black September of 1970, when Israel helped stop the Syrian invasion of Jordan, and everything that Israel has done until then were manipulations that stopped the Syrian Air Force and stopped the Syrians from taking over Jordan, and that is how Assad actually came to be in power. So there are many things that can be done. We should now maybe not speak of all of them, but we should maintain our interests in the Syrian arena, because they are very important. First of all, because that is the place where we can break off this axis, the Iranian-Syrian axis, and second, because we are a neighboring country that has a regime that has many ramifications. Now, one of the things that we keep hearing is a criticism, or sometimes even terrible criticism, about the negotiation with the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister yesterday spoke ill of the campaign with Syria. In his first term as Prime Minister with Ron Lauder, he had negotiations with Syria. Several Prime Ministers, Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, and Netanyahu himself, and also Ehud Barak, tried to negotiate with Syria, and at the moment it seems irrelevant, and it will take time until this regime will be replaced and the new regime will be stable enough and has an orientation that will show us whether there is any option of discussing some sort of process with him. This may be stalled for a while, but perhaps this will not be so. Perhaps it will be like with Saadat in Egypt. Perhaps a reasonable regime will replace Assad, and then we will be able to negotiate with them, maybe even in 2013. Perhaps they will replace Assad. They say they will be democracy now. They want to be liberal. We want to be pro-Western. And we want to do what Sadat did in Egypt when he jumped off the Soviet wagon onto the American wagon in the 1970s, and he won Sinai, which helped him a lot. And we want the Golan Heights. So when Israelis think about the possible ramifications of the changes in Syria, you can also think and consider that possibility. The last point I would like to say is that the lesson learned from the value of peace processes in light of what is now happening in Egypt. Every time an Islamist candidate or another, Amr Moussa, speak of the illegitimacy of the agreement with Israel and the need to abolish it or perhaps change it, there are some people in Israel who come and say, see, I told you so. There's no point in signing agreements based on territorial concessions. And that is what some people have said throughout the years. But we're saying whether it's tangible or intangible, reversibles for irreversibles, or the other way around. And that is true. But as the defense minister has said earlier this morning, we have had many years of peace, of quiet with Egypt, and as yet there has not been real damage to it. And I think that much of the argument should be pointed to or addressed at, whether by us or by others, to the Muslim Brotherhood and other factors in Egypt. You are responsible not only for Egypt's interests and the relationship between Egypt and the United States, but the future of any peace process in the region, because if you do what the Israeli right wing want you to do and prove that there is no point in peace agreements based on territorial concessions, you should be very careful what you do to Israel, because you will be deciding the fate not only of your relationship with Israel, but the fate of any future peace process in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Rabinovich and Ehud Yaari, Ambassador Negroponte, and of course Mark Heller. I'm sure that there are many questions that still need an answer, things that came up just now, but we don't have time. I really thank the audience on behalf of the speakers. We're taking a break, and we shall be called back for the continuation of the conference.